what are teacher support needs? And in RANA, like many programs, we face the challenge of trying to implement a complex instructional package with only about 5 days of initial training with teachers. So we knew that we were going to need a lot of ongoing support and follow-up. And our first step in determining how that would happen was identifying teacher support needs. So you can see in this image here, we have a few important needs mapped out. One of our biggest needs was lesson observation and feedback. Teachers had some opportunity for practice teaching in the training, but it wasn't enough to really solidify and internalize their lessons. So we knew they would need that ongoing support. Another big piece of the pie was reflection and problem solving on how individual lessons and the program as a whole was going. And then some of the smaller pieces were recognizing teacher success, preparing for lessons, and accountability for teaching on a regular basis. So that led to who can provide support and how, because in this map of needs, there's really more than one coach could do. So we set up a system with a variety of moving parts and actors to try to cover all of those needs. So we're using a system of monthly observations in which master trainers and SSOs, those are school support officers, part of the institutionalized supervisory arm of the government. We also have weekly observations, which are conducted by lead teachers or sort of star teachers in the school. We have weekly school meetings in which teachers, lead teachers, and head teachers are invited to reflect, problem solve, acknowledge success, and also prepare lessons. And then finally, we have ongoing accountability, that is by head teachers, to make sure that lessons are happening. So you can see that through these variety of actors, we were able to cover the spectrum of teacher needs. What we have in black is monthly support, and what we have in white is weekly support. One drawback of this system, of course, is that it is somewhat complex, and all of these different actors might have some different coaching styles. So we needed to determine a kind of simple coaching method that could be used in a variety of capacities by a variety of actors. So we had to ask what method is most appropriate. Specifically, are we going for soft, hard, or balanced coaching? Soft coaching tends to be a little bit more open-ended. Coaches encourage teachers to find their own answers to challenges in the classroom. On the other end of the spectrum is hard coaching, which tends to be much more directive and much more top-down. And in the middle, we have balanced coaching, which combines the two. So this image here is taken from a USAID report, The Power of Coaching. And this report does a really great job of articulating that decision-making process. How do you determine soft versus hard versus balanced? And they do say that in many of our contexts, many teachers are very inexperienced. Many teachers are accustomed to a kind of top-down directive education system, and so that's the kind of interaction they're accustomed to. So in some cases, that might be more appropriate. So for RANA, we had to ask, what is the background of our teachers and what is the educational style of the country? And many of our teachers do fit that kind of background. Many do not have very much training or experience, and many are used to a kind of authoritarian educational style. But at the same time, we wanted to try to push both teachers and coaches to think in a more balanced and open-ended manner as well. So we did pick a balanced approach for our coaching in RANA. And we think of coaching in 3 simple steps. The first step is letting the teacher speak first. So after an observation, a coach will sit down with the teacher to have a conversation and just ask the teacher, how do you think that lesson went? The second step, after the teacher has a chance to speak, is the coach points out what is going well in the lesson. And then finally, step 3, point out what can be improved in the lesson. So this seems relatively simple, and it is. It's not rocket science, but we have discovered that by couching it in a 3-step framework, it helps teachers and coaches really remember the importance of pointing out what's going well and allowing the teacher to self-analyze a little bit. Because we really noticed that there was a huge paradigm shift that our coaches needed to make. Everyone's instinct seemed to be to jump up and criticize elements of the lesson rather than stopping to look at the bigger picture. So by couching it in 3 steps, when they know they have to do step 1 first, we end up with a much more balanced coaching process. We did need to convince coaches and teachers that this is really the best method, and I think that we have. We had to provide them with a kind of rationale about why this might work. So for letting the teacher speak first, we discussed with coaches about how this equalizes the coach and teacher relationship and how this allows more empowerment for the teacher in their own classroom, and how it also encourages a practice of self-analysis of the teacher that hopefully the teacher can do even when the coach is not there. For pointing out what's going well, we point out it's more than just being correct. Coaching is about building a relationship, and pointing out what is going well helps do that. It also motivates the teachers by helping them feel successful, and it builds receptiveness for the critical feedback that coaches will provide at the end. And of course, that is our last step, providing concrete feedback to improve the lesson.
To answer our first research question, what is the relationship between the coach background and the coach quality, we did a regression analysis to test for associations between these constructs. The sample size and the R-squared on the regression were too small to be useful for prediction, but we found the following associations. First, the coach's credentials were strongly associated with each aspect of the quality of their performance as a coach, as measured by our instrument. Except for a slight association between their previous years of experience as a teacher and their rapport with their teachers, none of their other background characteristics were positively associated with their performance as a coach. In fact, their years of experience as a head teacher and as a coach were actually negatively associated with every aspect of our measure of coach quality. I'll come back to that. For our second question, what is the relationship between coach background and teacher instructional practices, the regression analysis showed a positive association between a coach's years of previous experience as a teacher and as a coach, and gains in their teacher's adoption of the instructional practices. However, neither their prior experience as a head teacher nor their highest academic credential showed any association with their teacher's gains. So what does all of that tell us about the kind of background that makes the best coach? Since that was a lot of tables, let's sum up what we found so far with some cute clip art. In our sample, the coaches with higher credentials scored better on our measures of coach quality, but their level of credentials had no discernible effects on their teachers' practices. Meanwhile, our coach's prior experience as a head teacher or as a coach was negatively associated with our measures of coach quality. This may be because traditionally the roles of head teacher and coach have been more inspectorial than collaborative or reflective in this context. So it may be that coaches with years of experience doing coaching a different way found it harder to do coaching the RARA way. At the same time, though, their prior experience as a coach and as a teacher, but not as a head teacher, was positively associated with improvements in their teachers' practices, even though none of them had prior experience with the RARA approach to instruction. All caveats aside, if these results are representative, they suggest that the best candidates to serve as coaches in this context are those with the highest credentials and the most prior experience as a teacher, and maybe as a coach, but not as a head teacher. Now for research questions 3 and 4. What is the relationship between the quantity or the quality of coach visits and teacher instructional practices? Our regression analysis found very strong positive associations between the number of coach visits received and the teacher's gains. In other words, the more a teacher was visited by his or her coach, the more they adopted the new practices. Curiously, and this is the head scratcher, we actually found negative associations with our measures of coach quality and the teacher's gains. For example, at the first line under negative associations, we find that coaches scoring higher in rapport with their teachers was negatively associated with those teachers' gains in phonics, and coaches scoring higher in reflective activities with their teachers was negatively associated with those teachers' gains in general. Parenthetically, one more point I'd like to mention briefly is that even though the teachers increased both their phonics and text-related instructional practices, nothing we measured in this study, not coach background, quantity of visits, or quality of visits, showed any direct association with the text-related gains, only with phonics. This finding leaves me wondering, why phonics and not text? So what do these results tell us about which is more important, the quantity of coach visits or the quality? In our sample, the quantity of visits helped, the quality didn't. So, some implications for programming. First, does the quality of the coach visit really not matter? Or do data limitations in our study perhaps obscure the true impact of coach quality? Or do our measures of quality not capture the kind of quality that matters? For example, our data didn't include whether coaches modeled the lessons or discussed assessment results, both of which have been hypothesized to be high-leverage coaching practices. Or perhaps coach quality matters more in a later stage of teacher development. It may be that when a teacher is first adopting a new practice, the driving factor in fidelity of implementation is just accountability. But once they have the basics down and they're ready to become more critical about the quality and the flexibility of implementation, that may be when this kind of reflection-based coaching is more important. At any rate, let's say for now that quantity trumps quality. Is this good news? Is ensuring the quantity of visits easier than ensuring quality? I mean, isn't it easier to just get the coach to go to the school and not even have to worry about what they do when they get there? Maybe. But of course, the quantity of visits also has financial implications, and it constrains how many teachers one coach can cover. Some work has been done already on the optimum frequency and coach-teacher ratio needed to affect change, but these are areas for further research. And at the same time, it would be nice if a quality coach visit could get more bang for its buck and reduce the overall number of visits necessary. Lastly, if at this stage accountability is all that really matters, is there not a cheaper way perhaps to do that than by coach visit? In the interest of time, I will only briefly address some of the limitations of this study and some considerations for future research. For limitations, first, the data were not originally collected for the purpose of this study, so some aspects of it were less than ideal for answering our research questions. In particular, the wide variation in when and how often the RANA staff observed the coaches. Two, the sample size was small. Obviously, a bigger sample size would give us more confidence in our results. Also, the intervention time was short. As I said, it may be that coach quality plays a bigger role at a later stage of teacher development. Third, coach quality is really hard to quantify. We may not have captured all of the important aspects, and it's a moving target. The quality support that most teachers received fluctuated over the course of the school year. And four, our teacher observation instrument recorded gains in the teacher's instructional practices, but not necessarily the quality of that instruction. It is possible that more reflective practice on the part of the teachers may result in less fidelity of implementation to a scripted lesson plan if the teacher is being responsive to and adjusting her practice to meet her students where they are. In light of these limitations, coach quality and/or other factors may have had a greater influence than our data allow us to see. Finally, this study was done on archival data, and we wanted to know what, if anything, we could learn from it. In the end, I think the data may have raised more questions than they answered, but we still think the exercise is valuable. Two areas of focus we see for further research include measures of quality. We'd really like to see additional refinement of the instruments used to measure teacher quality and coach quality in similar contexts. Exploratory factor analysis is one way to study the variables contributing to these constructs, and it would be really interesting to compare those results across contexts. And two, coaching contributions. If projects are already going to track coach activities for monitoring and evaluation, how can we systematically embed into that process similar studies to shed more light on which characteristics of coaching make a difference and how to optimize it? Thank you for listening, and please feel free to contact me at any time with questions or feedback.
Thank you, Karon, for your presentation. And as you noticed, it is pre-recorded because Karon is based in Nigeria and she doesn't have very good connectivity. However, she is online, and so we'll be able to participate in the question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So now we're going to move on to Amy Pallangyo, who's going to do the discussant for today's webinar, and she's going to be providing a couple of insights on coaching.
Thank you, Deepa. Well, in listening to the three presentations, I found it interesting, some of the parallel kinds of processes across them, but also I had thought about in advance and prepared some of my own comments and reflections on what I think is generally going on in terms of coaching in our African context in many places. And I also found it, I guess, kind of heartening that my point of view is fairly consistent with what was shared with us today. Some of the key points I'm taking away from the presentations is this idea of needing to provide multiple levels of support. One of the real interesting points from Emily's presentation is that combination of internal and external support, because I think it goes also to some of the data that we've seen from the RARA. Who is it that provides a comfort zone possibly, or provides a perspective that is familiar to the teacher, who can gain access in terms of having that relationship with a teacher that's necessary to move coaching forward. But then also the issue of accountability. So the balance between internal and external master trainers, school leaders, lead teachers, those who have been teachers, those who have been supervisors. It's interesting to consider and think about what's the best balance between those who may hold a teacher highly accountable through a coaching system and those who are there as kind of a soft coaching mentoring approach. I also liked hearing in the first two presentations about the implementation of what I really think of as kind of a peer coaching model, that very simple structure, but very powerful, where the teacher is the first one to share information in a coaching session, talking about what he or she thinks is going on in the classroom, thinks is going well, their areas of concern, and then the positive feedback from the coach for all of the reasons that were pointed out in both Kerri and Emily's presentations, and then following up with being able to get to the hard topics, those things that need improvement. Also linking in, particularly from Room to Read, that the areas or tiers of activity and feedback, keeping it targeted, keeping it focused, knowing as a coach that you can get to every problem in the classroom eventually, no matter which door you enter and no matter which avenue you take. So I thought those two presentations were really interesting in playing off of one another. And looking at the RARA research piece and the kinds of questions that were asked, the information that was shared in many ways doesn't surprise me. That those who have experience with teaching and coaching may be able to enter into a mentoring relationship with a teacher more quickly than those who are used to supervising. But then also this question of more time with coaching improves certain aspects of student performance, but those text-related gains coming later. It also begs the question, which I think Karon presented in her own words, that teachers may need different types of coaching and different kinds of support at different points in their own professional growth. So I was fascinated myself. Deepa has asked me then to also talk a little bit about the gaps and issues associated with coaching in Africa. And I've got myself on a timer, so I know I only have a couple of minutes. I'm going to try to go through it quickly because, as I said, my perspective is quite the same as the other three presenters today. So I'm just going to share with you, when I was reflecting on this question, what are the gaps and the issues and how do we take care of them? It goes to kind of the traditional hierarchical, even punitive monitoring and leadership culture that we sometimes run into, a very old-style top-down model, as was talked about in the presentations, really requires a culture shift in terms of the professional learning community, that community of professional practice. And this idea of bringing the balanced coaching approach, the hard coaching, the soft coaching, finding a mix of those, including also the observation that was referenced, even modeling, sharing of examples that work as well, and supporting coaching by coaching coaches at every level, which was mentioned by all three presenters today. I think also we can find sometimes when we move into a coaching situation that there is a lack of general infrastructure and logistical support. We may run into highly complex governmental structures that move from the top down, and identifying those, if you're working inside government structure, identifying those that have not only the best access to teachers on a regular basis, but also that background, that critical background that Karon was talking about, I think is difficult. So one of the ways I think about it is to come from the top and from the bottom at the same time. So almost bookend the process and really look at how do you work from top levels of government down by coaching at the ministry, by coaching into the regions, but then how do you create that one-on-one coaching relationship at schools at the very same time so that coaching comes down through the system, it also comes up from school. And in my opinion, that's really the only way to get a sustainable process. My timer has just gone off, but I'm going to take one more minute. I think one of the key problems that I know that I face in my work with coaching and convincing people of the importance of coaching, and in fact, trying to help them understand that coaching in many ways is much more important than training. It doesn't negate the need for training, because training can provide, a common set of information, a common set of approaches. Again, with ministries of education, there seems to be concern that they lose control over the message, they lose control over the process when they move from a training process into a coaching process. And my, response to that is to coach those folks who are worried about that loss of control, and to help them understand the length of time that's necessary to really improve teacher practice, and to have the patience and the persistence to continue to do it. So I guess in terms of looking back at the 3 presentations and my own reflection, I think we're really talking about professionalizing the work of teacher learning and the work of educational discussions among adult stakeholders at every single level. At the same time that there is some clear structure, there's a system of checks and balances that hold people accountable, because coaching can be like mercury. And as Karon said, even when you look into the coaching data, it raises more questions. So I think it's a critical place for us to continue to focus our work, our questions, and our research. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your insights. I want to move over to the question and answer session. I know we're running a little bit less on time, so if you can type in any questions, this is for anyone that's participating, if you can type in the questions in the chat box, I'll communicate it to the panel members. We have one question that's been given, or that's sent by Megan Thomas, and she wants to know if the panelists can explain where the coaches were drawn from for each project, what role were they in before, and also how projects dealt with attrition. We have found that often once you train coaches, they tend to leave you because they have increased skills. So we could perhaps have Emily answer or address this question first, and we'll go to Kerri, and then we'll go to Karon.
Hi, sure, I can address that. So we basically have a couple of different kinds of coaches. We have our school support officers, and we have our master trainers. And our school support officers were already in the system, and they were already playing a monitoring role. They were already going to schools, not necessarily observing classes, but at least checking in on accountability issues. And so our training with these school support officers was essentially to enhance and expand that role so they could play more of a mentoring role in addition to an accountability role. Our master trainers were drawn from a couple of different sources. One was the colleges of education, where a lot of teachers get their pre-service training, and the other was from the state arm of the education ministry, the SUBEB. So we were drawing from those 2 areas, in part because even if there is attrition with these coaches, at least they're remaining in the system. Although we haven't actually struggled with attrition too much, we keep our master trainer coach role to a somewhat part-time role. It's usually about 25%, and most of our coaches have been able to sustain that along with their existing responsibilities.
Thanks, Emily. Kerri?
Sure. Thanks for that question. So our coaches come from a variety of backgrounds. Our ideal is to have someone who is a former teacher and has that experience, but that's not always possible, particularly as the coaches are based in rural areas out by our schools. So when in the case where we can't find someone with that extensive education background, we count on our training and on our support to the coach to help build them up. So really do come from a variety of backgrounds. We will, check in with teacher training colleges and places like that to see if we can interest any recent graduates. But sometimes they are also people with other backgrounds, degrees in other areas. And the second part of your question about attrition, certainly it's a challenge anywhere. I don't know that we have a solid way of addressing it other than bringing in someone new and getting them up to speed to take over those positions. And I guess we like to think that at least they're going out to work in schools with the knowledge that they've gained, so still a win for the kids in the area. So, yeah, I think that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Kerri. Karen?
Hi, this is Karen. Like for Emily, with RANA, in RARA, we also use the school support officers whose they are part of they're in the ministry's system anyway, and they're the ones responsible for monitoring and supervising the teachers. And RARA was only 1 year long, so we didn't have a big issue with attrition because the project intervention itself was so short. But I think the idea is to work within that system, within the ministry system for as much sustainability as that offers.
Thank you, Karen. We have a couple of questions that have come up, so I'm just going to read them out loud, and if the three of you can write them down, and again, we'll go through the order, Emily, Kerri, and Karen, so you can address the questions. We have a question about how the how to train coaches to support teachers. That's one of the questions. Another question about the cost aspect. Has there been any, I guess, study or research done to look at the cost aspect? Is coaching more or less expensive than the existing supervisory system? Did supervisors make a similar number of visits before they started coaching? How did you persuade higher frequency if that was the case? What type of system do you use to collect the monitoring data that informs feedback to teachers from coaches? And one last question, and then I'll hand it over to all of you. In the selection of coaches, what personal qualities should we look for in addition to academic credentials and experience? So Emily, over to you.
Sure. So I'll try to go quickly here. In terms of how to train coaches to support teachers, I think one of the best tools we can use is a lot of modeling. So in our trainings, training of trainers, training of coaches, we do a mock lesson and then a mock coaching example. And we have a couple of volunteers come to the front and try to do our coaching process. And then as a group, we break it down and then we try it again. And then we send people out into small groups so they get lots of hands-on practice with coaching. And then our trainers and RANA staff can circulate and provide feedback on that process. I'm afraid I don't have very much information on the cost aspect of coaching, so I'll leave that to other panelists. But I believe our school support officers did go to schools about once a month prior to RANA, at least in theory. In practice, I'm not necessarily sure how true that is. As for data collection, we do collect data on tablets, at least for our SSOs and our master trainers. And that feeds into our fidelity of implementation data as well. And as a project, I think we're still exploring whether or not that's the best idea, whether collecting data on tablets kind of interferes with a more natural coaching relationship, or whether that is still is still possible. So that is kind of an ongoing question for us as a program. And in terms of selection of coaches, we did have an interview process. We looked for education credentials. We also had coaches develop a sample lesson plan themselves to see if they had a kind of good education intuition that would fit with our program. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Emily. And Kerri?
Yeah, thanks. So how we train coaches to support teachers, as I had mentioned, we train the coaches in not only in the literacy aspects of the program, but also in how to coach. And we talk about, the language that you use, both body language and words, and we talk about facilitation skills. So there is quite a bit of training. And like Emily, we also focus a lot on practice training. So we do try to be very practical, and after seeing a model, everybody does get a chance to try implementing themselves, whatever the skill is that was the focus of that particular session. So that is always a very large part of our trainings for coaches, teachers, everybody. the question about the cost aspects, certainly coaching is a somewhat costly endeavor, and we are exploring some lighter touch options for coaching. So, for example, in one of our countries, in Laos, they are just in the proposal stages of trying a model where they would do some of the check-ins by text message with some tips for teachers, and then mix that with the in-person support. So that's something that we're looking into. We want to approach it cautiously so that we don't impact the change that teachers have been achieving. But certainly it's always on our minds to make things more efficient. In terms of supervisors who made visits beforehand, there are some cases in Vietnam for libraries. We use government trainers who act as the coaches. And so they already had some visits that they were making, but we're asking them to shift how they do it. But in a lot of cases, the coaches are room-to-read staff, and visits by other people were often in a different, more of a evaluatory kind of thing rather than supportive. So I think it was mentioned in the broader presentation that the norm was a bit different. So that's not something that we've really taken into account, how those others are doing visits, unless we were trying to build them up towards a more supportive visit rather than an evaluation. Right now, our system for collecting the data by the coaches for the teachers is on paper, and then filling out reports that then roll up to the country office where we can look across data, which does involve some data entry. We are hoping maybe to move those onto tablets at some point. And then the personal qualities of the coaches. We do have an interview process, and like in many of the positions that we hire for, we're looking for people beyond their credentials. We're also looking for people who are open and seem willing to learn and try new methods and approach things with a collaborative frame of mind.
Thanks, Kerri. Karen?
Thanks, Kerri. I won't repeat anything that the others have said about the training and the personal qualities because we take largely the same approach, although if we're using existing personnel, if we're using existing within the system, we don't always have a choice of who is the coach with using an existing system. But for the cost, you know, this was actually the double-edged sword of the findings in this research, with frequency of visits being more, at least from the data, being more having more impact than the coach quality, because frequency of visits does, of course, have financial implications, mostly the cost of transportation and per diem for the coach to get out to the schools. You know, I was hoping that, well, maybe if we have a really good high-quality coach, then they can get the same effect with fewer visits and then save us money. But in this research, that wasn't the case yet. You know, before in RARA, these school support officers supposedly have the responsibility of visiting coaches, and I think this is similar in a lot of contexts where they have a position already within the existing Ministry of Education, and those visits may happen and then they may not happen, particularly if there's no fuel for the motorbike, or there's no motorbike, or the transportation costs are not paid. So I think when it's being supported by a project, then it's more likely that those trips are going to get paid, but then, of course, that's a budget implication as well. Some ways of perhaps mitigating some of those costs would be to look into virtual coaching, or at least maybe a blended mode of coaching where some of the support is through SMS messaging or whatever, or using these like on-site personnel such as, you know, the head teachers or lead teachers, like, for example, model that Emily presented in RANA, where you have the teachers themselves doing peer learning weekly because they're all on site, and then other coaches come in less frequently, but to offer a different level of support. And of course, clustering schools so that coaches can take, like minimizing the distance that they have to travel, that they can support a cluster of geographically close schools is another way. But definitely cost and even the coach-teacher ratio, how many teachers each coach can support and still put in enough visits to make a difference. Those are areas where we have done some study and looking into that, but I think that there's a lot more investigating to do for how to find that best cost efficiency.
But I wanted to thank all of the panel members, Emily, Kerri, and Karon, all three of you that, you know, presented great information about coaching strategies in Africa, and also thank you for answering the questions very quickly at the end, and because of time, the short of time that we had. And I also want to thank all the participants for their patience as we went through the technical issues, and also to Amy for being our discussant today. Before I end the webinar, I wanted to remind or just bring to attention to the participants who are on the call today that we are looking for people who are interested in being part of the steering committee. And if you're interested in being engaged in the governance of the Global Reading Network, we encourage you to go to our website to check out some more information about how you can be involved. Or you can send us an email, and the email is written on the PowerPoint that you see in front of you, info@globalreadingnetwork.net. I know I don't want to take up everyone's time because I know we went over almost 17 minutes for the webinar, but thank you so much for continuing to stay on and for your participation and your questions, and thank you again to the panel members. Have a wonderful day.